How's it going? So, one of the things that I have avoided doing on on any of the material I've been putting out the past couple weeks is addressing what happened in Floyd or what happened in Minnesota, not in Floyd. Um, and a lot of it really had to do with just trying to take a step back and focusing on how the media was covering it and how the media was presenting the stories that have been nonstop over the past few weeks. However, something happened this past week where it got me to thinking about a unique aspect of this of the past 2 weeks and where we're going from here. And basically that is the role of the South in all of this and what's going to happen in the South once we get through this. And I bring that up because this past week, two really strong conversations started taking shape. And one was over the Confederate monuments and one was over the flag. And ironically enough, it was NASCAR that got the conversation about the flag up and going again by banning it from their sporting events. And then, of course, and they've talked about the military bases too. I don't want to leave that out. But they've also, the monuments are back at the forefront of the conversation again. And I'm going to talk about all that. I want to preface it with all this before I get into that. What I want to preface it with is two things. Cancel culture is in full swing right now. Some of it is legitimately warranted. And we're going to talk about, the flag and the statues. These are all warranted things that should have happened a long time ago. Some of it is not. And I think we have to be careful as a culture which lines we cross. Take, for example, this all started, well, it didn't start, but the conversation about that cancel culture was leading began with the cancellation of Cops and Live PD. I've never even heard of that show, and I honestly didn't realize that Cops was still on. But in the aftermath of that, I read an article this morning on Yahoo News about, what do we do with SBU? What do we do with all these other, NYPD, or not NYPD, Blue Bloods? What do we do with that show? What do we do with any of them? And I think the idea of trying to cancel everything cop related is a mistake. I say that because a lot of times through art, we're able to explore different avenues of our culture. And if you completely cut something out of, or you completely shut down the avenue that a specific story or narrative is trying to go down, you run the risk of cutting it out of the national narrative or the national conversation. Now, having said that, there are ways to approach how we tell those stories in art. And I think if we as a culture back off and let the artist interpret the moment that we're in, because they are, that's the job of the artist. The artist is to look at the situation and present an interpretation of that situation. If we give them time to interpret it, I think we're going to see a lot of these police narratives that we ingest through TV and movies. I think we're going to see the way the stories are told change. Point of views and perspective will change within the narrative, within the story. So I think this idea of canceling all these police dramas and police culture within art, within our art, is the wrong avenue to take. And I say that from as a English professor and a lit professor specifically, because in my when I teach American Lit in both iterations, whether it's part 1 or part 2, and understanding the dichotomy between the two is imperative. In part 1, I theme it around the question of what is the American identity, because during part 1, we go from contact to roughly the later 19th century. Where, typically in the canon, you cut it off at 1865, which is the end of the Civil War. But I go further than that, because if you cut off at the Civil War, you don't really address what is happening in a post-Civil War world, and how the politics in the South remain intact after the Civil War. It just changes faces. In part 2, we focus on the question of the American dream. Does it exist? Now that we have a semblance of an identity, American identity, what is the American dream? And the answer to both questions are, with the American identity, there isn't one. Within the literature, we create one, but the other thing that the literature does underneath it is question that identity and question how valid that identity actually is and whether it is exactly as presented by the popular culture. And then with the American dream, the question is, does it exist? And the answer is yes and no. It exists for each individual, but there is no universal American dream that actually exists, right? So, and that's something that the later writers of American literature, or the more recent ones, during the 20th century, are playing with this idea of, can you have an American dream in the society that we have, and what does that dream look like? And it's all built on the individual. Each individual is respectively, each individual sees the American dream from the environment that they are raised in, whether that's, in a black household in Brooklyn or a white household in Nebraska. These are completely different American dreams. And the way the culture is built to allow those dreams to flourish has a hand in that as well. I said all that to tell you, at the end of American Lit 1, the last thing that I have my students read are excerpts from a book called The Leopard Spots. Now, I do that on purpose. If you don't know about The Leopard Spots, I'll give you a quick history of it. It's part 1 of what's known as the Klansman trilogy. And it's one of the books that was used for the development of Birth of a Nation. If you don't know Birth of a Nation, the film Birth of a Nation, you need to look into it. Now, I don't do it to teach my students racism, and I don't do it to teach them Klan ideology or try to recruit them in any way towards that. What I do is I show them that after all the strife that we've seen leading up to the Civil War in the literature of American Lit, we get to The Leopard Spots, which is late 19th century, and it hasn't changed. And I show them that, and I show the other fundamental piece of that is that the entire Klansman trilogy takes place in North Carolina, which is where we are. And so they get to see the mentality of North Carolinians, not all North Carolinians, but North Carolinians at the turn of the century. And of course, we talk about the irony of the fact that North Carolina is seen as a progressive state during that period. And even into the 20th century, we get a very strong reputation of being a progressive Southern state. and how that meshes with the ideas of this series of books that promotes Jim Crow, segregation, and that kind of thing. And so it's important to understand or be able to look at those things in a historical context and understand why we did what we did and how not to do them again, and to expose the problems with the pop culture narratives that we get. And so I think when we look at canceling all these police shows and police movies and going after these fictional characters that represent a point of view that an artist saw at that moment, I think is the wrong thing to do, because we get to see how the artist is interpreting that moment, and we can learn from it. We can learn a lot from it. It's weird because last night my sons and I were talking about Mortal Kombat. And I remember when when it originally came out on Nintendo, and the unbelievable controversy that surrounded it. And of course, as a culture, we were immediately trying to get rid of video games because, how much does violence in video games actually affect youth? And you can go in, and I'm not going to go into the studies and that kind of thing, but that was the question we were asking. And so it was a knee-jerk reaction. I think that's what we're going through now as far as the police culture, is this knee-jerk reaction to eliminate any kind of view of police within our art. Now, views of police in reality need to change. And that is the driving force right now for these protests and for this cultural movement that we're in. That is the reality of the situation needs to change. But how we depict that reality, how we interpret that reality in art does not. We need to let the artists do their work. And they will naturally, through evolution, give us new stories and new points of view. And having said that, let's talk about the Confederacy in the South. The statues, first of all, the statues should have never gone up. The majority of the statues that we're discussing in the media today were put up during the Jim Crow movements of the South, and they were blatantly used to intimidate black voters and black neighborhoods and black populations. They need to come down. They needed to come down a long time ago. They should have never gone up. Renaming the military bases, I'm all for that. I think the conversation needs to be why we named them after these Confederates to begin with, if they were traitors. It's a tricky history. It's a very complicated history. It is not a black and white history, unfortunately. There's a lot of gray in there. But we do need to rethink how we present certain cultural aspects of our society, and how we put them up on different platforms. And then, of course, there's the flag. The flag, and you go down this road, the flag itself is mired in all kinds of problematic discussions, where the defense of the flag is, it's not even the Confederate flag, it's the battle flag. It doesn't matter, because what has happened is that different groups have appropriated that flag and redefined what that flag stands for. True, in 1861, from 1861 to 1865, that flag was used on the battlefield to mark Confederate soldiers fighting against the Union. Why were the Confederate soldiers out there? We know the answer. So that flag, based on the original intent of the flag and then what has happened once it's been appropriated by certain groups, it needed to go away. It should have gone away a long time ago. In fact, it should have gone away at the end of the war. Now you know my stance on the monuments and the flags. So let's talk about the broader conversation about the South. Because in all of this, there is a conversation to be had about the South and what's known as the Southern myth. And the Southern myth is basically this. And it's a lot more complicated. I'm going to oversimplify it, but the general gist of the Southern myth is that the North came down and took away our livelihood and ruined us. Now, historically, if you look at it, economically, you can find some truth in that statement. Reconstruction was a disaster. Congress, which at the time was made up largely of northern representatives with heavy influence, wanted to punish the South, and they did. And I could go into how, even today we're still culturally behind everybody else because of what happened during Reconstruction and after Reconstruction, where you see the exploitation of an economy that was in shambles. And instead of trying to rebuild the economy, there were a lot of people who came down to take advantage of the economy down here. Now, having said that, what happens is you get a lot of resentment from the old white aristocracy in the South, to where when Reconstruction is over and the North starts to pick up their bags and they move west for the next opportunity, you see white aristocrats who are still mad, who carry a lot of anger, start to reinstitute, as best they can, a society that resembled what happened in the South. From that comes the Southern myth. We need to return to our former days of glory. I mentioned in one of my blog posts about being careful with the national media, because the national media focuses on liberal versus conservative. The real struggle in this country is an economic struggle, the haves and the have-nots. And for centuries now, white landowning elites are the haves, and everybody else are the have-nots. One of the things that happened during this antebellum South that you don't hear about in the Southern myth is how the aristocracy, the white aristocracy, which is the plantation owners, created this narrative that if you give black slaves freedom, they will take your lives. They will take your money. They will take that little bit of property that you own away from you. And they repeated this narrative and repeated this narrative to the point where it was so ingrained that we're still dealing with that today. And it's a narrative that has not stopped. And we can see echoes of that narrative with the immigration issues that we had not 2 years ago, when the border wall came and they started locking these people up in cages. The narrative from the far, far right was they're going to come to this country and they're going to steal your life. They're going to take your job. They're going to take your property. They're going to take everything you own. This is a narrative that has been in the South for hundreds of years. And one of the negatives that the northern elite class picked up from us was how well we constructed that narrative, and they have applied it to national politics now. And it's obvious. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's there. Pick up a book and look. Look at your news articles. It's everywhere. Okay? And the Southern aristocrats in the antebellum South perfected this narrative. So much so that when the North, again, at the end of Reconstruction, when they pulled out, the Southern aristocrats that were still angry about losing everything in the Civil War just reapplied it. And of course, we have the dark days of the late 19th century, early 20th century, leading up to the civil rights movements. The problem with that is that it has, as a culture in the South, it has been so ingrained in us that we were invaded by this foreign force in the North and forced to live their life, that we have pushed back for 150 years now. We have pushed back as hard as we can to hold on to that Southern myth. And this is not an old struggle. William Faulkner made a career off examining the ludicrous and the ludicrous nature of this Southern myth. The two characters, Joe Christmas and Quentin Compson, are perfect examples of how the Southern myth doesn't work and how it's a fable. And so when we look at Faulkner, we shouldn't look at Faulkner as progressing Southern ideas, because he's not. What Faulkner does in all of his novels is expose the Southern myth as a myth, that it is not real. And so these ideas that the South had for a long time, and we still have them in very dark corners of the South, and really on the surface, in the more progressive parts of the South, we have these same ideas. Gentrification is a result of hundreds of years of trying to keep this narrative going. So here's the question: where does the South go from here? And there's going to be a lot of pushback, but I think we've gotten to a point. Why it took this long, I don't know, but I think we've gotten to a point where the South is faced with one of two choices. And that is either, and these two choices are basically get over the Civil War, get over the Southern myth, get over this idea that Dixie was a beautiful, wonderful place when it never was. Get over the end of slavery. Get over the end of segregation. Get over these things. It's done. The resentment is not getting us anywhere. So that's the first choice. The second choice is, or be destroyed. And I don't mean like the army coming in and invading the South and putting us down. But it is extremely obvious that the rest of the country is moving forward. And this time, we're not going to have the luxury of the TVA to come in and save us from being left completely alone. So the South is going to be facing, over the next several months as a culture, we're going to be facing the question: either we get on board and move forward and leave the Southern myth behind, or our culture will be destroyed because the rest of the country is moving forward. They're progressing. And it's time for the South to get on board. I came to that question. I came to those two things. I've been thinking a lot about this. The day that they announced that HBO Max was taking Gone with the Wind down. And at first I had the knee-jerk reaction of, oh, that's political. Then I realized, no, wait a minute. That movie depicts the Southern myth. It plays it out right in front of you. At the beginning of this, I talked about how important it was to hold on to that art. Because HBO Max pulled it doesn't mean you can't get a hold of Gone with the Wind. But I think it was a very strong statement by HBO to say, look, we're not going to promote this point of view of the Southern myth, which is fine. And that's the beauty of art. It can be there without promotion. It can be there without a group of people who oppose it falling in line with everybody else just so we can have the art. At the same time, we don't need to destroy the art and completely get rid of it, because at some point we need to go back and look at it and understand the point of view. But it raised that idea for me that we need to think about the Southern myth and these things that we're not letting go of in the South. It's time that the South let go. So that's my 2 cents. Make it a great day. See you guys later.